Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving into something that I bet most people haven't really thought much about before. It's called proprioception. And it's
Okay,
like
that's
our
fun.
body's internal GPS.
Yeah.
But instead of guiding us through streets and cities, it helps us understand where our body is in space.
Mm.
We're going to be looking specifically at how proprioception plays a role in the experiences of autistic adults. And we're going to be using an article from the website Cheap ABA.
Okay.
It's a blog post called Adult Autism and the Seventh Sense, Unlocking the Power of Proprioception.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we'll be looking at both the challenges and strengths related to proprioception
Mm-hmm.
and how it can impact people's lives.
Most people, they don't realize how much they rely on proprioception until it's not working properly.
Right.
It's what allows you to walk without looking at your feet, or to type without staring at the keyboard,
Oh, yeah.
or even just to sit up straight without having to, constantly adjust yourself.
Huh. It's like our body is on autopilot in a way.
Yeah,
Exactly. But what happens when that sense is different for someone? What's going on with proprioception for autistic adults?
So there's actually two main ways that this can manifest. So some autistic adults experience what we call undersensitivity
Yeah.
to proprioceptive input. So basically their brains have a little bit more difficulty processing those signals coming from their muscles and joints.
Okay.
And that can result in things that might look like clumsiness or balance issues.
So would it be fair to say like their internal GPS is a little fuzzy?
That's a great analogy. And then on the other side, we have oversensitivity, where the brain's actually receiving those signals too strongly. So for these individuals, even a light touch might feel like a poke, or the feeling of clothes against their skin might be extremely irritating.
That makes me think about those clothing tags
Yeah,
that like a lot of people find annoying.
exactly.
I can only imagine how much worse that would feel for someone who has proprioceptive oversensitivity.
Absolutely. And all of these differences
Yeah.
can lead to a whole bunch of challenges every day for autistic adults.
Like what sorts of challenges?
Well, think about something as simple as tying your shoes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems simple enough, but that actually requires a really complex sequence of movements that your brain needs to plan out ahead of time, and we call this motor planning.
Well,
But if you're undersensitive to that proprioceptive input, those blueprints that your brain is using might not be so clear, making the task way more difficult.
it's interesting because tying your shoes is something that like a lot of people learn as a kid and then never think about it again. But for someone who's struggling with motor planning,
Right.
that could be a huge challenge.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just shoelaces.
Mhm.
Imagine, the difficulties this can pose for more complex tasks, like
Right.
cooking a meal or even just writing legibly.
Oh, right.
It's easy to see how this could lead to frustration and maybe even some social anxiety.
Absolutely. And then there's that sensory overload piece
Yeah.
that we were talking about earlier. I can't imagine how overwhelming it would be to constantly feel bombarded by like sensory input,
Yeah.
especially from things that most people don't even notice.
It can be extremely debilitating
Mhm.
for some individuals. The blog post even mentions how seemingly harmless things like tight clothing or a firm handshake can trigger really intense discomfort
Wow.
and even meltdowns in some cases.
That's a powerful illustration of just how crucial this sense is to our daily experience. It's definitely giving me a new perspective on things.
And the thing is, most people don't even realize proprioception is at play until something goes wrong. But for autistic adults, these challenges are often a constant reality.
This is really eye-opening. It makes you realize just how much we take our senses for granted.
It's true. But, even though these challenges are very real, there are also ways to harness the power of proprioception
Yeah.
and to really make things better.
Okay, now this is where it gets exciting. I'm
Uh-huh.
eager to hear about what can be done. What does the blog post suggest?
So one of the simplest and most effective approaches is deep pressure. That
Whoa.
feeling of calm and security you get from like a tight hug or being wrapped up in a weighted blanket. It turns out that this deep pressure actually stimulates our proprioceptors, and it has a calming effect on the nervous system.
I've always loved the feeling of a weighted blanket,
Hmm.
but I never connected it to proprioception. That makes sense, though, that feeling of being grounded
Mhm.
and secure.
Exactly. And then there's also this idea of proprioceptive exercises. So these are activities that specifically target and engage the proprioceptive system,
Okay.
kind of like giving your internal GPS a tune-up.
What kind of exercises are we talking
Well,
about?
they can be anything from yoga and Tai Chi
Oh, wow.
to something as simple as carrying heavy grocery bags
Huh.
or jumping on a trampoline.
Okay.
It's really about getting those muscles and joints working
Yeah.
and sending strong signals to the brain.
So I'm guessing even something like dancing could be beneficial.
Absolutely. Anything that involves coordinated movement and
Yeah.
spatial awareness can help improve proprioceptive processing. The key is to find activities that are enjoyable and engaging,
Yeah.
so you'll stick with them.
That's a good point. Shouldn't feel like a chore. I'm already thinking of all the ways that I can incorporate more proprioceptive activities into my life.
That's the spirit. And then there are even more specialized techniques that can be really helpful, especially for individuals who are struggling with some significant challenges. We call these sensory integration techniques,
Okay.
and they often involve a trained occupational therapist.
I'm curious about these sensory integration techniques. What's the thinking behind them?
So the basic idea is to retrain the nervous system to process sensory input more effectively. And this includes proprioceptive input. And this can involve a bunch of different techniques, like using weighted vests or blankets, or engaging in specific exercises, or even just incorporating sensory-rich activities into daily routines.
So it's not about fixing the problem, but it's about learning to work with your sensory system
Exactly.
in a way that makes life easier and more enjoyable.
Exactly. And what's really great about this approach is that it's highly individualized. So an occupational therapist will work with someone to understand their specific needs and develop a personalized plan to help them achieve their goals.
That's a great point. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. And finally, we can't forget about the role of accommodations and adaptations. This can be anything from wearing adaptive clothing that doesn't have bothersome seams or tags to using mobility aids if balance is an issue.
I'm noticing a theme here. It's all about shifting the focus from limitation to empowerment.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing those challenges, but then finding ways to support and empower individuals to really thrive.
I'm already feeling more empowered just learning about all of this. And I bet for someone who's been struggling with proprioceptive issues their whole life, this knowledge could be incredibly validating.
It often is. You know, it can be like a light bulb moment, suddenly explaining why they've always felt different or struggled with certain things. And that understanding can be so freeing because it opens the door to self-advocacy and seeking the right kind of support.
It's about understanding your own needs
And
then being able to articulate those needs to others so that you can get the help that you deserve.
Exactly. And that can make all the difference in the world.
This has been so insightful. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this fascinating topic.
There's definitely more to explore.
Stay tuned, listener, because we're going to be diving even deeper into the world of proprioception and its implications in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our exploration of proprioception and its connection to autism in adults. It's amazing to me how something so fundamental to our daily lives can be so often overlooked. It makes me wonder, are there any common misconceptions about proprioception, especially in the context of autism?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest misconceptions is that proprioceptive challenges are always obvious. You know, people assume that it's always going to look like clumsiness or a lack of coordination. But for some autistic adults, the struggles might be more internal, like a constant feeling of being off, or difficulty with those fine motor skills that other people might not even notice.
So it's another example of those invisible struggles that we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
That must make it even harder to get the understanding and support you need.
Exactly. And another misconception is that proprioceptive issues are something that you just grow out of. While early intervention can be incredibly helpful, these challenges can persist into adulthood. Even if someone has learned to compensate, they might still experience difficulties in certain situations, or when they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed.
It makes sense. It's like anything else, stress can amplify our existing challenges.
Right.
I imagine it's also important to remember that everyone's experience with proprioception is unique, even within the autistic community.
Absolutely. What works for one person might not work for another. It's all about finding those individualized strategies that bring relief and improve quality of life.
Speaking of strategies, I'm curious to hear more about how occupational therapists can help with those sensory integration techniques. We touched on it briefly before, but I'd love to dive a little deeper into what that process actually looks like.
Sure. So an occupational therapist specializing in sensory integration will start by conducting a really comprehensive assessment to understand the individual's sensory processing patterns. And that includes proprioceptive input. They'll observe how the person moves, how they interact with their environment, and how they respond to different sensory experiences.
So it's a very personalized approach, really getting to the heart of the individual's unique needs.
Exactly. Based on that assessment,
Huh?
the occupational therapist will develop a tailored plan that might involve a variety of different techniques. We talked about weighted vests and blankets, but there are also specific exercises that are designed to target proprioception, like pushing and pulling heavy objects, or engaging in joint compressions, or even using a therapy swing.
It sounds like a very hands-on approach, really engaging the body and the senses in a therapeutic way. What's the ultimate goal of these interventions?
The goal is to help the individual better regulate their sensory system so that they can function more comfortably in their everyday life. You can think of it like fine-tuning the volume knob on their sensory experiences
Yeah.
so that those everyday sensations are no longer so overwhelming.
It's like finding that sweet spot where their sensory system is working with them and not against them.
Exactly.
I imagine that can be life-changing for some people.
It absolutely can be. By improving proprioceptive processing, individuals can experience improvements in their coordination, their balance, their body awareness, and even their emotional regulation.
It's amazing to think about the ripple effect that something like proprioception can have on so many different aspects of a person's life.
It's true. Our senses are constantly feeding our brains information, shaping how we experience and interact with the world.
And when one of those senses is off, it can create this like cascade of challenges. This whole discussion is making me realize how much we take our senses for granted and how crucial they are to our overall well-being.
That's a great insight. Proprioception is no exception. It's a fundamental sense that impacts so much of what we do, from the simplest actions to more complex tasks.
It's like this hidden foundation
Yeah.
that supports everything else. And that's why understanding proprioception, particularly in the context of autism, is so important.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing the challenges, but also finding ways to support and empower individuals to thrive.
It's about fostering a sense of agency and helping people find the tools and strategies that work best for them. I think this deep dive has really shed light on the power of proprioception and its impact on autistic adults.
It has, and it's hopefully sparked some curiosity for our listeners about their own proprioceptive sense and how it shapes their experiences.
You know, as we've been talking about these challenges, it's also important to remember that proprioception isn't just about overcoming difficulties. There's a whole other side to this story. And that's the potential for proprioception to actually unlock strengths and passions in autistic individuals. We'll be back after a short.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about all the challenges related to proprioception and autism, but now I'm really interested to hear more about that flip side. You mentioned the potential for proprioception to actually unlock strengths.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, so consider this.
Yeah.
Some autistic individuals might actually naturally gravitate towards activities that provide like a lot of intense proprioceptive input. So think about things like weightlifting or martial arts or dance, even playing a musical instrument. All of these involve a lot of proprioceptive feedback and can be incredibly engaging and even calming for some autistic adults. So it's not always about like mitigating sensory overload. Sometimes it's about seeking out those sensations that really ground you and provide a sense of focus.
Exactly.
I can definitely relate to that on some level.
Absolutely. And, you know, these aren't just any activities. Think about the focus and the precision and the body awareness that's often needed for something, like playing a really complex piece on the piano or mastering a really challenging martial arts move. It makes sense that some autistic individuals might really excel in these areas.
It's a good reminder that neurodiversity isn't just about differences, but it's about strengths and unique perspectives. We shouldn't just be focusing on what people might find difficult, but we should be focusing on what they might excel at as well.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
You know, understanding proprioception helps us to appreciate those strengths even more. It's about seeing the world through a different lens and recognizing the value in those differences.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that proprioception is this really powerful sense that can have a really profound impact on the experiences of autistic adults, both in terms of challenges and strengths. And understanding this kind of like hidden sense can open up so many possibilities for support and self-discovery and even just celebrating neurodiversity.
It's been such an insightful exploration, and it's really shifted my own perspective on how I think about the senses and how they shape our experiences in the world.
I'm glad to hear that.
So listener, as you go about your day, we'll leave you with a thought-provoking question. What's one simple activity that you can try to become more aware of your own proprioceptive sense? Maybe take a mindful walk, focusing on the feeling of your feet on the ground. Or try a yoga pose, paying attention to how your body is moving through space. Or even just give yourself a big hug and notice the feeling of that pressure and warmth. Whatever it is, we encourage you to explore and see what you discover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into proprioception and autism.